Well, thanks everyone for joining us today. My name is Toni Gentilli, and I am the curator of exhibits here at the Maxwell Museum. And today we're going to be talking about REZ, a version of which is behind us here. This incredible show is a traveling site-specific experimental photography exhibit and collaborative museological project. That's a partnership between Dene photographer Rapheal Begay, independent curator Lillia McEnaney, and Matthew Chase Daniel here, who is part of Axel Contemporary. And we are proud to say that this project is funded by the National Endowment for the Arts, as well as supported by the Alfonso Ortiz Center for Intercultural Studies here at UNM. And so I will just introduce each of our panelists here to talk about this. What we're going to be talking about today is just the experience of taking this exhibit on the road in the Axel Contemporary truck this June. Rapheal Begay is a visual storyteller based in Window Rock, Arizona, and his work is informed by cultural teachings and land-based knowledge. He activates landscape photography and oral storytelling traditions to document and celebrate the Dene way of life. He holds a BFA in photography with a minor in arts management and a certificate in museum studies from the University of New Mexico. Most recently, he curated Horizons, Weaving Between the Lines with Dene Textiles at the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture in Santa Fe. Then we have co-curator Lillia McEnaney, who is a museum anthropologist and independent curator based in Santa Fe. She is assistant curator at the Museum of International Folk Art and secretary of the board of the Council for Museum Anthropology, and serves on the Rail Yard Park Art Conservancy's Public Art Committee, of which this guy is also a part. Along with Dr. Jennifer Genital, she co-curated Nothing Left for Me, which is the larger exhibit behind you here at the Maxwell. And she's working on associated projects with the Navajo Nation Museum and UNM Press forthcoming. She holds an MA in Museum Studies from New York University and a BA in Anthropological Archaeology and Religious Studies from Hamilton College. And then Matthew Chase Daniels here to my right is a photographer and sculptor and the co-founder, co-owner, and co-curator of Axel Contemporary, together with Jerry Wellman, who unfortunately can't join us this afternoon. Matthew is also a radio and podcast host of Coffee and Culture, curator of the Lina Wall, and a member of the Rail Yard Art Committee, all in Santa Fe. He has a BA from Sarah Lawrence College and studied cultural anthropology, photography, and ethnographic film in Paris, France. And just a little bit more about Axel Contemporary for those of you who might not be familiar. It is a 6 by 10 foot art gallery on wheels, housed in a custom retrofitted 1970 aluminum truck, which you'll see plenty of pictures of right behind us here. Yeah. So Axel Contemporary was founded in 2010 as a collaborative work of art and innovative vehicle for arts distribution. It has since grown beyond the confines of the mobile exhibition space and now also includes book publishing, alternative methods of creation, and dissemination of contemporary arts in the public spheres. So, yeah, official. So thanks for being here, everyone. And yeah, I just wanted to hear more about your experience of taking this show, which has its origins here at the Maxwell Museum. I wonder, Rapheal, if you could talk a little bit about the origin story of the REZ project.
Sure. Yeah, it's everyone. She Rapheal Begay Unishe, Hanaat in the Schlin, Kithlachiti, Bashichin, Taban Dashache, Ashin Dashanella, Sinishchi, Chishike, Adose, Hosan, Asha. I'm from Hunters Point, Arizona, based in Round Rock, and I just introduced myself with my 4 clans. But the origin story of REZ and its origin story specifically to the Maxwell stems from a solo exhibition here at the museum in 2019. It was a selection of photographs of the Dene cultural landscape, a body of work that I've been building for a number of years and had the opportunity to work with former curator Deborah Romanak to bring the show here. And a selection of those pieces are on display here behind us. And a selection of those photographs were then incorporated into new photographs that were then shared within the Navajo Nation with the REZ tour. But being based on the Navajo Nation, there isn't really much of an infrastructure or places to showcase the work, or maybe even sometimes hold space for conversation regarding, I guess, photography in this case. So an idea was to think about how we could activate rural landscape and community gathering spaces with photography. And working with Lillia, Axel, and Maxwell, we were able to come together to think of an itinerary and a project, both in person here at the museum itself, to sort of have different facets of what that could look like.
That's great. Thank you. I was wondering if, maybe we could expand on the 4 themes of the exhibit that are really kind of touched on within these photographs, and provide a foundation for the on the road portion of the exhibit.
Sure. So in addition to the title of All Res, the notion was to celebrate reservation-based life, remind reservation-based residents and community members of the beauty, vitality, and freedom that's found within their backyard. A very similar approach to my practice as a photographer. But in addition to that, there are themes that have developed through this body of work: Kéyah, land, Hooghan, home, kinship, and ina, life. These are broad terms. They're also cultural teachings. There are visual themes throughout the imagery within the work, but it's all about relationships, interconnection, and my relationship to these themes within my life as a Dene person. But and it's interesting that I had these concepts developing as an artist and a collaborator, but throughout the experience of All Res and sharing it with my community, that's obviously been expanded upon. It's been a little bit more insightful and definitely more emotional, more sentimental, as opposed to something that is primarily creative or artistic in its intent. It's something that has become somewhat of an embodiment. And these themes are topics and conversation starters within the work. So the photographs themselves become conduits for conversation relating to these 4 themes. And we created questions that allowed our participants to have reflections based on some of those topics. One of them being, how has res life made you resilient? How can you be a good relative? What is a memory from the land that you feel worth sharing? What is a teaching from the home that you enjoy seeing within the world? I think part of the premise of All Res was trying to make it accessible to my community, but also allowing them to engage with it and contribute to the stories that I'm sharing with them, and therefore bringing it back here and hopefully using that as the inspiration for the next steps. But I'm curious for my colleagues and collaborators, knowing that you've had time to go out to the reservation, how has that maybe expanded for you in terms of land, home, kinship, and life?
Yeah, well, like this picture that's here of the res dog, it's a very strong picture, and people seeing it here or seeing it in Santa Fe are like, oh my God, what kind of dog is that? What's going on? And a lot of people on the res are like, oh, I know that dog from my grandmother's house, or a dog like that. Like, it was much more familiar scene, and they felt a resonance to it there. And so spending the time and through long conversations with you, but with so many people who came by and talked about their reactions to different of the photographs, drew me in. The reservation is vast, and there's a lot of people there, but as a outsider, if you go there and you drive through, and you can go to the grocery store and buy some food, or there's a few restaurants, but there's not a lot of easy ways to connect with the people there and understand cultural values and things. So taking Axel out there, having our mobile gallery with you and with your work, gave us a reason to have conversations. And that was just such a special thing for us. I think for Lillia and me and Jerry, all 3 of us, and Toni for a day when she was there. And the photographs, they're in picture, they're almost like these windows into a world. and relating to those themes, and talking to people like one guy, a traditional knowledge holder in Shiprock, came by and he said, "Do you know what Kéyah means?" And I was like, "Oh, okay, let's see, land kinship. Which one was that?" The name Bazad is not so good. I was like, "That's land." He's like, "No, it's not land. It's the place that I touch with my feet or whatever." And he was explaining to me how land is a relationship between the earth and yourself. And so many of these four terms all are related to that. Mm-hmm. And that so much of the culture has to do with relationships between things, between five-fingered beings and the natural world, between different parts of the natural world, all of that. So
that's a hard answer to follow up on, Matthew. But that I agree that I think that this experience really opened my eyes, in addition to everything that Matthew was saying, just to how those four themes relate to my own life. I am from the East Coast. I am an only child, so I don't have these larger kinship networks in my life, and it made me reflect kind of on my own upbringing and my own way that I interact with the world and the world around me, and how I came to live in Santa Fe. In maybe a more critical and nuanced way. But I think it's also something that really came up throughout the exhibition process, is this idea that a photograph really only has the meaning that's imbued on it by the viewer, right? So just like museums, photographs are active generators of knowledge and continue to produce meaning with every different context that it's portrayed in. So I think it was a really wonderful thing to be able to, and Matthew and I were kind of just sitting on the side of the van, like hanging out with each other while Rapheal was doing his thing. So just being able to have the privilege of being a part or a bystander in those conversations was really wonderful. And like I said, an immense privilege.
Thanks. I think, building off of what you had just shared, I'm wondering if Rapheal and the whole crew could talk a little bit more about the context within which the exhibit was stationed across the Navajo Nation, and how you selected the places where you were taking it.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, going back to thinking about the origin and the intent, it was very commendable intent in terms of what I envisioned, and taking the input from colleagues and friends and community members, what this could be. But in thinking about bringing the first traveling photography exhibition to the Navajo Nation, it was important for me to think about reciprocity and equity and accessibility, not necessarily just with the imagery, but in the way people were welcomed into the space. So as you can see some of the images, there are photographs on the side, there are photographs on A-frames, there are photographs that are printed and hung within the mobile gallery space. But it created this sensory experience that wasn't bound by, in this case, Navajo white walls. But I thought about, if it were to come to Navajo Nation, knowing that it's 27,000 square miles and is comprised in 3 states, how can it exist throughout the entire Navajo Nation? So I decided that it would be best to work with the 5 regional agencies: Eastern, Fort Defiance, Central, Western, and Northern. And there is regional pride, regional dialect, and knowledge within these places. And I wanted each of them to have a space, or at least for them to relate with one another. In addition to that, it was important for us to meet the people halfway, to go to community gathering spaces, events that are already happening, like the Navajo Rug Auction, or meet them at the flea market, art sprawl, or other places where there are public lands, and these are sacred places where people go to pilgrimage, such as Canyon de Chelly, Monument Valley. And these are regional points of pride and interest from a tourist perspective or from a visitor's perspective, but also from the community members themselves, having pride from where they're from. Oh, that's my mountain, or that's that sacred site that I identify with, or my clan is in relationship to the stories that come from these places. And then moving in a clockwise fashion, it was important to incorporate genetic cultural epistemology and teaching and lived experience. So moving in a clockwise fashion in relationship to the sun, in the way that one would enter a Hooghan. So individuals would come into the space, they were welcome to share a story. The photographs were there to spark memory, reflections, emotions. People shared reflections about home, what it might sound like or smell like walking into your grandmother's home after not visiting for a long time. But that was the premise of it, and it was beautiful and healing, and I think it was that energy moved everywhere we went, and the stories kept building, the experience kept building, and it was, definitely a commendable effort. And I've realized, and a lesson I've learned from it is being present as much as possible can be very draining. But that was the intent of the show, being present and creating space for one another in ways that maybe weren't imagined before.
Anything to add to that?
Well, I just, and when you're talking about the 5 different agencies and stuff, I noticed again, in Shiprock, talking to a guy who repairs windmills, and he's like, yeah, I'm all over, and I think we have 150 windmills on this side, and there's 200 on that side. And it took me a while to figure out what he's talking about, this side and that side. And it was on the Cheska Mountain, the mountain range that runs along the New Mexico-Arizona border, is sort of a dividing line between the two sides. And then Christine Ami, who we talked to too, said, oh yeah, I live on the nice side, over in Saline, and there's a dry side and a wetter side, and there's real cultural differences in the different areas. And even like in Monument Valley, the architecture of the Hogans and the sweat lodges is different from what you see down near Window Rock. And there's what may be subtle differences, but spending, a lot of time over that course of that month, you start to have a little inkling of that, which is just kind of beautiful and engaging that in those spaces.
Right, and the images that were selected become symbols. They become signs. They allow people to see themselves. They become mirrors. And thinking about it, growing up on the reservation, I wasn't necessarily able to travel my home and get to understand it in that way until I got older. And I feel that some community members may have a small idea of home or what the reservation may be. And so individuals were able to see different parts of the reservation, different ways of people creating fences from different parts, how people herd their sheep, how they care for their corrals and things like that. But they're also universal. Hence the themes themselves allow people to connect despite those geographic or cultural differences.
There's a book in your collection. So Rapheal also brought a collection of maybe 20 books or so that were there, and people could look through them. And we would drive, Jerry and I had 2 cars, so we had Axel in another vehicle, and Jerry and I would drive back to Santa Fe for a few days every week and then go back out to do the show for a few days every week. And the last week I didn't want to drive back, so I just camped in Axel for the week in Monument Valley and Navajo National Monument, and but with Raphael's collection of books. And so I read a bunch of those, and there's one book with photographs of different Hoogans from different parts, and it's just beautiful to see that variety. But like what you're saying, there's differences, but they're all have a similar meaning. They're all part of the same structure and traditional thing.
Well, that leads me to ask for insight from any one of you about what you think of creative placemaking and its role within this project. Like, how did you see that manifesting? And did it meet your expectations, or was it different than what you thought it would be? And also the ways in which maybe some of the people that you were having conversations with were reflecting on the specificities of place and the relationship to it.
I can go first. Within my work, I think of SITE, SITE and SIGHT. So that allows one to be present and have perspective, distance, light and shadow, still about relationships. But thinking about that with creative placemaking, how can we activate the landscape to be its own gallery, or the land to be an extension of this experience? I mean, Axel and the REZ aesthetic to it had this ultimate backdrop, but the Navajo Nation behind it. So we're able to create something and bring something to the reservation and to these locations that's never existed before. And we also created a very welcoming, safe space to share and reflect. And by way of that, it was activating this particular location. And it started to reflect the individual, community, and regional base knowledge, aesthetics, understanding, humor, relationships. And I think looking at the reservation, despite its limited venues for these types of conversations and initiatives, I think moving forward now, it's thinking about collaborating with the landscape, collaborating with the elements. We got to Crown Point, it was our first stop, and I was like messaging the team like, hey, it's raining there. I don't know how we're going to adjust, and Matthew reminded me that with the work that he does and this mobile gallery component of Axel, it's you have to be prepared for that. And standing out in Gallup and just in the heat and trying to be present and talking to so many people was so draining. But also to be able to take a moment after visiting Canyon de Chelly, going to Spider Rock, sitting on the cliffside and just reflecting on everything that was shared with me and everything that I've offered and what this could mean and what the future could look like. I think it's not necessarily one moment or one act, but it's an experience that takes place. And it wouldn't be possible, similar to you guys all being here, we're all coming together to activate space together, and that can exist within the landscape.
I think creative placemaking is a big term, and it often you feel like it has to be some like big making of some town plaza or something to make it more amenable for conversation. And I think a lot of the beauty of this project was that there's an ephemerality to it. And we were inserting our project into like the Gallup flea market or the Shiprock flea market. The flea markets were these great venues because people come. It's like a community gathering space. It's affordable for people to have booths. Some people are selling their own tools. Some people are selling traditional medicine. Some people are, food, or a gazillion different things. And in a way, it was very unusual to have a art gallery with nothing for sale there. And people were like wondering what that was. But in other ways, it totally fit in. Like people were there because they wanted to go out on a Saturday morning and walk around and maybe run into people they knew and look at stuff. And so part of the creative placemaking is just recognizing what's already there. And like, I didn't think of it, but like when in Axel, we've done tours around New Mexico doing a photography show, and farmers markets are like our favorite place to set up because it's a similar sort of thing. Flea markets, in Santa Fe, not so much anymore. But flea markets out on the REZ were fantastic in that way. And I was like, oh, this is amazing, anyway.
I think the notion of the ephemeral nature of it is really interesting and important. And my seat is it's facing this quote. The other exhibition from Dr. Jennifer Jeanette Dale, who's a professor in the history department, in the American Studies department here at UNM, and she's a historian. And she says, places have long served as durable symbols of distant events and as indispensable aids for remembering and imagining them. And that obviously speaks to this question. I'm just staring right at it, but I think it's a really important point about just creative placemaking as a way to highlight the beauty of something that's already there. because our project is really about amplifying the voices of the participants and of the audience. They were the ones who were creating a lot of this beauty. Obviously, the photographs hold a lot of the beauty, and the truck was incredible. You know, people loved asking questions about the architecture of the truck, right? But it's really providing well, we hope it provided a platform for people to kind of, like Raphael said, recognize the beauty inherent within themselves, and that they don't need something like Axel to creatively activate a place. We're just kind of a conduit to maybe remind them that this is something that everybody can do in their own way, and they don't need these kind of institutional structures or people to point them in that direction.
And just to add to that, that was beautiful. And within Navajo Nation's governments, they have policies within historic preservation, and there's a term called traditional cultural property and how the tribe defines it. So a TCP could be the site where the remnants of your umbilical cord were buried, which is a story to navel, which is the photograph here with the where mine is buried in relationship to where I grew up. But this is already a part of the vernacular on the reservation. And when I would share that story, oh, mine is buried here, and this is how I resonate with it. And I gave the example earlier of the, say, like Shiprock having this monolith in the middle of the desert, having so much pride and story and cultural teachings associated with it. I think that's also an extension of creative placemaking, not necessarily in its physicality, but in the way that it exists and within our memory and our stories and our language.
Great, thank you. Well, I'm curious a little bit about how this process of engaging in conversation with people around your photographs, it might inform your photographic process moving forward, Raphael.
The experience alone and being able to create that experience for others was very healing. I think that is the biggest thing that I've taken away from this experience. And I thank you all for making that possible and believing in the idea and the intent of what that could be. And I think it was also healing for those who were able to share. And I think within my work, it's primarily been geared to, or received and shared with an external audience. And this was really an opportunity to share it with my people, to reunite those stories and landscapes and scenery and create a space that allowed them to remember and love themselves in a way that maybe we take advantage of or tend to ignore on a daily basis. Is about literally being. Because of that now, it's informed my work in the sense of asking myself, why am I creating images now? Is it for a creative career? Is it to continue to collaborate on projects? Or is it something as beautiful of preserving a memory and sharing it with people that I love, the sentimental aspect of an image? I think within the museum realm and as an artist, it tends to become a product. It tends to become a tool as opposed to a relative. And I think I'm looking at my work in that way now. And I was just mentioning to the team here, there's a certain amount of grieving in this process of after going out into the landscape in my community and creating something so beautiful. And then to go back to my 8-to-5 government job is a very jarring experience, but also asking myself, how do I steward the experience that was very healing to me? And how do I continue the work in terms of collaboration with my people, with their stories, their experiences, and how can I protect and preserve that? I think that's the work I've been doing thus far, but it's definitely become a little bit more tactile.
Well, I think collaboration is definitely a theme of the project, and I don't know if anyone wants to speak on, what this process illuminated for you about collaboration, its potentialities, its challenges, successes.
So collaboration, I'm sure, everybody is kind of a buzzword these days, right? Just like creative placemaking, like everything has to be collaborative, but nobody really knows what that means. And it means something really different in every context. So I think I'll answer the question in terms of collaborative approaches to museum work, which is also a really big buzzword right now and has been for several decades at this point. But as I'm sure many of you know, there's a really long and violent history between museums and Indigenous communities and anthropologists. And that history is based in Darwinian social thought that continues to emanate throughout museum spaces today. And ever since the late 1980s and the passage of NAGPRA in 1990, there's been a big push for museums to quote unquote consult or collaborate or partner, and all of those three things mean different things with Indigenous community members and just not only Indigenous folks, but just communities and people who are quote unquote on display in exhibition spaces. And I think with that, there has been a really fundamental shift in the idea of what a curator is. The idea of a curator is usually when you imagine a curator, right? They're older and they're in an office that they've been in for like 60 years, and they often are very academic without a lot of engagement. And that's just the historical kind of stereotypical image of what a curator is. And they're often seen as experts in something. And I think it's really important to instead reframe what a curator is as to somebody who is more of a facilitator and someone who is just kind of more interested in making spaces and institutions for those voices who have previously and historically been marginalized in those spaces. And I think that shift is really important, and it's not something that is under the radar these days. This is something that museums are really aware of and doing that great work, but it's something that's really hard for a lot of different reasons, and a lot of those reasons are institutional, they're structural, they're societal, they're based on budgets and scheduling. And so some of the things that I think continue to be challenging with all collaborative projects are kind of this idea of moving at the pace of collaboration, right? Like you can't really stick to your normal institutional schedules. You have to kind of reframe the way you think about budgeting and what you're prioritizing with your budgeting. And those are kind of the foundations. Those like boring things are the foundations for what makes a positive collaborative project. And so that's something that was so wonderfully freeing about this project, is having two amazing institutional collaborators, Axel and the Maxwell, that just kind of allowed us to do our thing, or for Rapheal to do his thing, you know, and you guys were so incredibly patient and flexible and just kind of letting the project form, maybe without a final end product, is something that's not common. You know, we still don't know what the final outcome of this project is going to be. We're still kind of digesting what happened and the recordings and all of that. And it's just wonderful to be able to work within an institution that allows for that creativity and for that collaboration in like a more structural level rather than on a project by project level.
But I always say that, you know, if you do something by yourself, if you screw it up, that's your own fault. You just don't do it, whatever, you move forward, you take a break. And then if you have two people, it's maybe twice as easy and also twice as hard to agree. And then if you put in a third person, it's not now 3 times as hard as it was, it's 10 times as hard. And that's true. But also, I think it also in that way brings that much more richness to a project, because you have these different voices, different approaches, different way of thinking about things. And so for this project, it's the 4 of us here, and Carla Sinopoli and Deborah Romanek and Joe Wellman, all who contributed to this. And we all have a unique ways of thinking about things, and our different roles that were somewhat delineated and then somewhat overlapped. And so I think And Joe and I were presented with the idea, we were like, well, that sounds great, yes. You know, and then there's the question of raising money and, you know, all this stuff. But Raphael was really the one who had the vision for it and selected the places and had knowledge of his work, of course, but also knowledge of where we were going and what would work. And maybe, and I'm sure Raphael learned things along the way, and might do it a little bit differently if we did do it next month. But I'm just rambling on. I don't know if I had a point to that, but it's just it's been a real pleasure to collaborate with this group of people and get to know everyone and bounce things off each other and learn and grow and not just the 6 of us or 7 of us, but also all the people who came by are real collaborators on the project. And that's something that at AXA happens a lot. You know, people are always often very appreciative of what we do. And we say, well, we couldn't do it without you. You know, if you don't come by, it doesn't exist. And that was especially true on this project.
Yeah, I think it's, you know, the team is based here in Albuquerque and Santa Fe. I'm there on the reservation to work across technology and meetings and checking in and using different tools to try and make things accessible. And I'm personally within my work, tend to work alone, pretty seldom do I really get the opportunity to have a team that really supports me in the vision. So that in itself was a learning process and trying to navigate that, hold myself accountable, but also making way for something that is happening organically, something that hasn't existed before, being open to, being present and responding when need be and emotionally available to people. But I think it's at the benefit of the future of these type of initiatives that it does take a team, it takes a village, it takes multiple voices. And knowing that that was the premise of the project and the exhibition, to have it come full circle in that way, to know that that was the basis of its creation, I think is worth noting. And I think that allowed us to have a lot of fun with it.
I think I'll ask one more question and then we can turn it over to the audience if folks have questions or comments they would like to share. But I guess I'd love some insight from you about the community's reactions to the project, their reception, and you know, what were maybe some challenges and what were some successes in that part of the collaboration.
I think thinking about success, I remember a friend of mine asking me when I was sharing this project and what I was hoping to accomplish with it in all its many facets. And he said, well, what does success look like for you, knowing that it's going to happen organically? You're not sure how it's going to end up. You're not sure what the end product could be, or even understanding your own energy and time that you can commit to it. What does success look like for you? I said the fact that it is physically going to be there in these different locations in itself, whether no one shows up or not, that in itself is a success to me, because it's been a dream of mine to have this, to create something of this nature. But I was surprised by the amount of people who came out, who were willing to engage and take a moment and share their story and speak to something higher than what that day was. I was surprised with how emotional it really was. I imagined, and I was very nervous, obviously, but you know, I thought my fluency, my language would come into question. I thought the way that I was raised and coming from a academic and creative standpoint, as opposed to living that every day. I live on Beverly Hills Street in the capital of the Navajo Nation, as opposed to someone who doesn't have running water or didn't go to college, or someone who I don't know, I wasn't sure what that would be like. And I thought it was an act of vulnerability of putting myself into my community in that way. But I realized very quickly that those who were open to experiencing all REZ were as vulnerable, if not more, because they were taking a chance on something, again, similar in the way that we were, that didn't exist before, or weren't sure what it could be, but we were happy to be there. And I was also surprised with the amount of admiration of, I don't know, when people would share their story and they're reflecting on a photograph, just this light and this beauty and this energy would just like blossom. And yeah, that was, at the end of each day, I would feel so exhausted and I just need to get all my thoughts out, and I would be nearly moved to tears to think about everything that was shared with me. And thinking back 3 weeks ago, right, it's a month-long initiative, and the reality of switching back into a different mode, and that something was romantic, beautiful, free, and alive. I didn't expect that. And I think it's still taking me some time to really grasp what that feeling is, but it feels like love. And I never really thought anything I created could love me back in that way, let alone it to be an extension of my being and have that be reflected back on me again. That was probably the most phenomenal part from the experience alone.
Thank you for sharing that, Raphael. Just to add a little bit further context to what Raphael just shared, we did not include any labels on the van. There were no titles, there were no dates, there was nothing. And I think that really allowed the space for visitors to come in and feel like their voice was being prioritized, because they were the ones who were actively creating the curatorial narrative for each photograph, but also for the project as a whole, which is obviously very different than how you usually go into an exhibition and there's a thesis and you learn the thesis and you learn why. And that was something that was just really wonderful, because now for us, and for Raphael especially, I don't want to speak for you, but all of these photographs now have a different meaning and different meanings based on the different stories that we heard about them. And I feel like it's all become a part of each photograph and the project as a whole, and in a much more maybe tangible way than was expected.
I think since you asked about challenges, one challenge that I felt in the process of it being out there was an idea that we would record stories of people as material for Raphael's future work. And we wanted to be very respectful and not record stories that people didn't want us to record. And so we had a release form that people could sign. And as we went through it, days and days and days, it became evident that it was very difficult to up front say, do you mind if I record? Will you sign this form? So sometimes that worked. Sometimes it was signing the form afterwards. Sometimes things were recorded. Sometimes they weren't recorded. And where that goes and how that's used in the future is an ongoing question for all of us. Because some of those stories are held in our memories, and Raphael was much more engaged in talking to people than the rest of us were, but some of those are recorded, and the same with the photographs. A lot of the photographs here, not that one, are, Raphael would be having an intimate conversation with someone in the truck, and the rest of us would be sitting outside, and I'd pop in with my phone and take a little picture, and they're engaging photographs to see. But again, like, I didn't want to interrupt and ask to take a photograph, but I also didn't want that moment to not be recorded somehow. And how, especially in sort of the museum context where we are today, how do you find that balance of what is appropriate to record, what is not appropriate to record, when you need permission, when you don't, how you use it, where it's stored, where it's archived. So those are just open questions that I don't feel are resolved for any of us. But they're alive for all of us.
Yeah, and that extends into the space of funding as well, right? And expected to produce an end product and a report and what were the results of this project, right? So it's a structural issue.
Yeah, and that's a very good point. I had, tried to do my best to remind myself, because once I start talking and engaging, that part of that facet of the project just went out the window.
Mhm.
Being present and engaged and willing to receive and share was more important to me. And being present and not using the project to try and extract.
Mhm.
I wanted it to be an experience. I wanted it to be an exchange. And just even during our opening reception here outside in the museum, people would come in and they just would share
Mhm.
before I even be like, hey, this is being recorded, blah, blah, blah. And as more people would come, and I would just like, people come in, people wanting to come in, and I'm sitting there trying to have an intimate conversation. People are peeking their head in like, what's going on? Can I come in? And I didn't want to disrupt that exchange that was happening. And that was fascinating to me. I wasn't necessarily sure how it was going to work. We kind of had a draft idea of what that process would look like, but it quickly took on a life of its own. But there were other folks who were very adamant that, no, I want to share, record me, let me sign this. I want this to live on. I want this to go. Others were like, well, I'm not necessarily comfortable with it, but I'm glad I shared it with you. And we have some of those recordings. And so the idea now, I think, is to be inspired by it, use it as reflection, and to create this cumulative curatorial framework that is respectful of their, I suppose, intimate and casual conversation that we had.
Mhm. Well, thank you all for sharing your reflections about this multifaceted experience. I just wanted to take a little bit of time and open it up to the audience. If there's anyone who has a question, yes, please go ahead.
Are these the photographs that were displayed in the vehicle, or did they change as you traveled?
These are a selection of the photographs that were exhibited in 2019. But the photographs themselves were wheat pasted on the side, so those were fixed. I think the main thing that changed was the composition of the A-frames to reflect the different landscapes and spaces that we were in. Initially, that was a conversation of it reflecting the regional knowledge and community members. So for example, a lot more shiprock and shiprock, some of the more Western scenes and experiences could have been incorporated into Monument Valley. But what I realized very quickly throughout the process was how taxing it was in terms of being present and trying to facilitate and record and travel and go back to my day job. I think if I could do it again, I would commit the whole month to it and let everything go. Because I think in that way, it could have achieved a lot of those intentions and those questions that initially were had in our initial conversations. But that's kind of how the process went.
There were, I think, maybe 21 or around that number of photographs between what was glued on the outside of the truck. The A-frames, there were 14. There was 6 or 7 on the outside. Then there was more inside. Some of them repeated small framed works inside were also maybe on the A-frame. I think all of these were in that, except maybe this one. But there were a lot more.
I'm sorry if this has already been explained because we got here just at the end of your start. But I assume the exhibition is not over because you're doing this. But how long was it a month? You mentioned a month for you to go to all these places. And also I'd like to know, what do you plan to do with this? You're going to take the places and show it. Anything else?
This is the last day or weekend of this show in this space. the show, the traveling show came down at the end of June. Raphael still has a lot of work. The weed pasted work was scraped off and didn't last, but the images. So this is the end of this whole phase of this, but you can speak more to the future.
Right. Yeah, it was during the month of June, and so every weekend, every Friday and Saturday is when we would travel. Folks would come out from Santa Fe, I would meet them, and we would just move every weekend. But what we realized, Matthew was there in Kayenta, the word of mouth marketing and buzz and curiosity and excitement people had when they saw, sheep plastered inside of this van, driving to bashes and then going around the corner, and he was sharing screenshots of people being like, I saw that REZ van,
Yeah, someone posted on Instagram who I didn't know, or I don't think any of us knew, said, yay, he was outside Basha's on Friday. And then someone else wrote, he spent the night camping at Navajo Nation Monument. I was like, who knew? I was out there alone.
But that was pretty fascinating, and but it just goes to show that I think that type of not only presence during the actual event in these particular locations, but the presence within the community, having it being incorporated into the community, I think is important next time around. When we initially started the project, we had this website, we still have it, so we wanted to have it be a digital replica, or at least a source of documentation of our experience, which rested on me a little bit more. But again, so with the stories, the intent is to put them on the website, have it be accessible to the participants, which will be password protected, so that they can reference back what they shared if they wanted to, but also hear the stories and memories of others who participated in the project, not necessarily within their community, but all across all 5 agencies, or at least in those locations. There has been conversations about whether the work could culminate in an exhibition or a publication. I think a publication would be pretty interesting as a physical thing that could live on, knowing that there is this ephemeral component of the project itself.
To your question about next steps also, I think something that we're really thinking about is making sure that our next steps follow the ethos of the exhibition in terms of reciprocity, right? We don't want to create another exhibition that falls back onto old patterns, right? We want to make sure that any publication that we do, or any book that we do, or like Raphael said, the password protected website continues to foreground both project participants and large Ajane community members as the primary audience, but also we would love to share it with Maxwell audiences too, right? And make sure that students get engaged and think and use it as a pedagogical tool, and use it as in a more traditional museum sense, right? Because we don't, so there's really that tension of being sure that we're foregrounding that audience while also making sure that it's also accessible to people like students at UNM.
Have you thought, given any thought to other vehicles to put yourself on the reservation? Lives of the people there?
Yes, I have. I'm not going to put it on mine anytime soon, but thinking about it, on the Navajo Nation, we have charter buses that can take you from one region to another, right? Have this bus system. But the thing about it is they'll put large scale photographs of Monument Valley, Shiprock, very serene and picturesque. And I remember thinking how fun it must have been if I were younger to walk up and see this all res bus or truck van with images of, of my home, my grandparents' sheep. And what could that look like now? And thinking about how the landscape and the reservation and community gathering spaces are now the museum. They're now the gallery. How can I transition my work and my practice into that? And instead of, folks who aren't the prior or instead of folks who are outsiders or visitors to the experience, how can people who are the experience, who are the storytellers, who are the individuals and stewards of these teachings be the primary audience within their own space? It's about reconnecting and reestablishing that, which is important to me moving forward. But if I could, I would put it on, I don't know, maybe a flatbed and create a mobile exhibit. Fairs and parades are pretty big on the Navajo Nation, so that was also an inspiration because it's literally a mobile exhibit just for a day. So people kind of had a familiarity with it.
Yeah, I love the way you talk about the experience and just sitting here watching you interact, it gives me a taste of what the word could have been that you went through and thinking about the result. Well, the result, there it is. It's this growing communication and inspiration that we give each other and through communication. And also the thoughtful reflections that we have, the language we use that is respectful and it's tender and it allows us to touch in our own feelings. You know, me, a visitor who has nothing to do, but I feel the tenderness in myself, and out of that tenderness can come creative energy. And then I think, well, hey, that's what the world needs. So it's like the sourdough that bubbles, and I'll be very curious to see how you can turn that sourdough into a bread that then other people, when they receive the bread, they can still feel that process that the bread went through and also be nourished by that. So thank you.
I think all of you here are now part of it too.
Yeah.
This is another stop along the way. And it was, Raphael's mother was there at the show. There she is. Raphael's father was there and cousins, and Lillia's father was there, and my wife Julie was there. And so it felt very like a family in a certain way. It was very nice that way. And those people were insiders, not outsiders to it all.
Right, and it goes back to the universal themes of the exhibition in terms of lands. It's something we all can relate to, place, our surroundings, whether it's a reflection of it or we're intentional in terms of creating it, but also the sensibility of home. Home itself is not bound by border, state line, region, chapter, or geography. It is inherently within us, and I think that was something that resonated throughout the project. This notion of kinship, being open and willing to relate. In order to relate, you have to understand your own positionality, have some humility and a willingness to learn and to engage. And then with life, it's not something that can be contained, bought, or sold. It will continue to exist. And I think that is a very good point in the way that this project continues to grow and evolve and be present in our lives in one way or another. Just like a memory.
I would love to speak a little bit about the title, Raphael, which I know has history for you.
Right.
And so it's an somewhat informed question, but lots of curiosity. And I just want to say, we always hear when we think about collaborative work that at its finest, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And I just want to say, as a person who's had the chance to see this project spring into being and the collaboration that's gone into it, it's one of the most beautiful things about it is that the whole isn't static. The whole is continuing to emerge. It's emergent as we are here today. There's still much more that will come out of it, and there's being able to see that and feel that, like as Annette said so beautifully, and all through this crystal lens of just love that you bring to the work that you do is incredibly moving. But the reason why I'm asking specifically about the title is because it's framing. And so much of what you've talked about today is about framing and how we frame for ourselves, for each other, how physical spaces are frames, how photographs are frames and doorways, And so how does all res work for you as a frame and doorway? And, you know, I would just love to, I would love to hear that.
No, I appreciate it. It's a great question. Thank you for that. Life on the reservation is beautiful. It's exists from multi-generations since time immemorial. And I am the extension of this love story that occurred between my ancestors, through my clans, through the sun and the sky and the earth and the water. I am a love child of it. And so, but it also can be challenging, life on the reservation. And I think growing up for a long time, I didn't appreciate it in the way that I do now. And I'm continuing to evolve that appreciation and expand it. And it took me some time to realize that I had that realization after moving away, coming here to Albuquerque to UNM and pursuing my undergraduate degree, and then going back. And that expansion and that realization is something that I want to give to my relatives, to remind them of the beauty of the everyday, of what's in their backyard, of who they are, where they come from, the challenges that they overcome, the opportunities that they engage in, who their grandparents were. So it's both positive and negative. And I think within Indian country or with indigenous humor, being from the res has certain connotations to it. It can be less than, it could be hard, it could be cultured, or whatever. And growing up, that's what it meant to me, to be all res, kind of dirty almost. And I wanted to reclaim that. I wanted to take pride in being all res. I wanted to take pride in things that are happening on the reservation, life on the reservation, with all its flaws and its beauty. And I wanted to gift that to my relatives, that they can have that realization at any given point. And obviously they're aware of it. It was just simply a reminder of like, hey, you're beautiful, you're sacred, you're powerful, you're strong. You should be proud of who you are in the same way that I'm proud of you. And that's what it meant to be all res. Thank you.
I think that's the perfect note to end on. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today and being part of the All Res project. Thank you to each of you for taking some time out of your busy schedules to share more about your experiences in this with us. Thanks, everyone.